how do you manage the risk of moving too fast versus the risk of moving too slow?
Innovation moves at a speed that goes beyond policy and the thought of how you're going to contain something.
How do you integrate risk management into the product development process itself, rather than just bolting it on at the end?
It starts at the architecture. Thinking through and doing threat modeling up front and making sure that you're thinking about how these things can be broken.
How has your definition of risk evolved over that time?
When I first started, I thought that we could mitigate everything.
What is the most dangerous assumption that enterprises are making about AI risk right now? Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of PureLogics Pulse. This is a podcast powered by PureLogics where we explore technology trends, product innovation, and digital transformation. This is Mohsin Ali and I spearhead AI initiatives here at PureLogics. Today we're tackling a question that is currently reshaping boardroom strategy discussions across the globe. Who owns AI risk in the enterprise? As AI transitions from a pilot project to a core business driver, the liability for its decisions is becoming a high-stakes leadership challenge. Our guest today is a master of navigating these complex security landscapes. Joshua Douglas is the SVP of Product and Engineering at Xtract One Technologies. Josh brings more than 2 decades of experience, including almost 12 years of tenure at Raytheon, and was pivotal in the $6 billion acquisition of Mimecast. Having served on the board of directors of the National Cybersecurity Alliance and as a member of the Forbes Technology Council, he is here to help us define who owns the AI risk within an enterprise. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a bit about yourself and your journey.
Sure. So I think you said a number of things for me already, but I come from a long line of technical experience. Both as a practitioner and as a builder. And, that's been fast and furious throughout the years, but it's also gained me a lot of insights on how to grow this, both from a business and a strategic standpoint, which is where I've been focusing probably the last 10 years of my life, is really driving good products into the hands of amazing customers.
Very well summarized. How does Xtract One work? And what's the technology behind it?
I'll give you the simple answer and then we can get into some of the technical aspects. But what we do simply is we allow people to get safely into buildings or venues without friction, trying to enhance their safety. So you probably have been to a number of places where security is a primary factor, an airport, maybe even something like a courthouse. Hopefully not for your own doing, but going in there, they don't really care about your privacy and they don't really care about the speed of how you get in there, and safety is the number one factor, right? When you try to transition that into, let's say, schools and corporate buildings or even sporting venues, that's not the kind of experience that you want. So what we do is we look for weapons on people and ignore their personal belongings without them having to take everything out and divest and have their privacy impacted. Very simply put. How do we do that? We do that with using analog signals and converting them to digital signal processing. And then we use AI to analyze all those signals and compare against tens of thousands of walkthroughs of people, both personal belonging items and threats. And it's very important to understand that process because that training piece is very important in some of the discussions that we have around risk.
That's phenomenal. I think that's such an interesting concept, and these priorities are becoming more and more important for public events. And there's a real case for such technology to be ubiquitous everywhere. You drove a $30 million to $100 million transformation at Raytheon Cyber Services. In transformations like that, how do you manage the risk of moving too fast versus the risk of moving too slow?
I think in any sort of situation, innovation often outpaces your risk because innovation moves at a speed that goes beyond policy and the thought of how you're going to contain something, right? So I think building it in from the start is very important. And that doesn't mean creating onerous processes or driving a lot of things that create slowdowns in innovations. but it's empowering the people as much as it is driving for that success. So a lot of times it means getting your team involved and making sure that the processes scale and have everything in them. So that way, when you have that definition of done and definition of ready, you're thinking about it from the beginning to the end when you're actually delivering. Automation is another key part of it as well. So when you're actually driving those risk tolerances and safety aspects in, you want to automate as much of it as possible. So that way, out-of-box thinking can occur at the end on how you can break and find new risk before it gets into the hand of your customer. Because at the end of the day, it's not about mitigation. It's about risk tolerance and minimization.
Absolutely, and that's very succinctly put. As the SVP of Product and Engineering at Xtract One, you're building physical security in the technology that's powered by AI. There are so many moving parts to this, and you presented us with a very apt framework for the analysis of such risks. How do you integrate risk management into the product development process itself, rather than just bolting it on at the end?
Yeah, and I think this has taken some years of pain on my side to kind of make sure that I get it all in place. But it starts at the architecture, thinking through and doing threat modeling up front and making sure that you're thinking about how these things can be broken. Same thing comes from AI models. Like, you need to really think through and how you're going to drive some of that bias out and eliminate it as much as possible, because these things learn what you teach it. And then as you're working through that process and driving that threat modeling and that architecture, you want to make sure that you do solid quality assessment across the board, be it doing analysis in the data modeling side and finding out where you have gaps. When you get to that and actually having manual tests to make sure that you're not missing things, and then even doing a full system end-to-end testing and validating those pieces. But once you're finished with all of that, you're not the only one that's going to have insights into it. Your customers are going to give you feedback. And you also need to be hiring third parties to really test and validate those models and make sure that there are no gaps.
Absolutely. And I think federating that responsibility or dividing that responsibility among your team, that's a very, very smart approach and a good recommendation for anyone out there that's building a secure application. You've spent over 2 decades at the intersection of cybersecurity, product, and strategy, from Raytheon to Mimecast to now Xtract One. And whenever we're talking to subject matter experts, the most beautiful are often the simplest ones. How has your definition of risk evolved over that time?
Yeah, I think that when I first started, I thought that we could mitigate everything. And, as I fought against like advanced adversaries, what people call today is nation state attackers, when I was dealing with a lot of this stuff, there's people just as smart as you on the other side of the keyboard. And it's a financial game more than anything else. How can you raise the bar high enough that you are not the weakest gazelle in the bunch? And so if you can drive that up to a point where you can continue to provide good insight, little risk, and get that risk tolerance to a place where it's acceptable for the business, that's the best approach. I think that the other thing that I also have learned is that it's not about me. And it's not about what I do. It's not about the technology. It's a combination of people, processes, and technology. When I was a chief information security officer, some of the best successes I had was when I empowered people that weren't even in cybersecurity. And I explained to them the things they should be looking for and how they could actually advance the security inside of our organization. Some of the coolest attacks that we stopped and got ahead of were because of those people. Not because of me, not because of my team, it was because of them.
I think that's such a beautiful concept. I think to be able to de-incentivize the attack for adversaries is something that I extracted from your last discussion, and the simplicity with which some of these things can work. Just having best practices there to protect against common attacks, let's say, that prevents the majority of the attacks that you would face. Leaving aside some of the advanced cyber attacks that you'd face. I think that's very eloquently put. You've sat on multiple boards, including the National Cybersecurity Alliance and the ITISAC. From a board governance perspective, are enterprises actually prepared to own their AI risk, or are they just checking a box?
I think if you would have asked me that question 2 years ago, I wouldn't even said there was a box. Um, I think that at the speed at which we're moving and some of the things that we're seeing in our society and some of the things within the geopolitical landscape, people are taking it serious now. You know, people want to ensure that both models are not going to end up harming people and also that they're not going to be on the hook for it at the same time. So I've seen several boards that I've been involved with in the last, like, I don't know, probably 6 months, all adopting new policies, all driving for creation and acceptance of AI that they can use inside the organization, both from a protection of their intellectual property and also from a protection of the company itself and the risk that it ends up taking on by having things like agentic AI.
Absolutely. I think that's been a very refreshing change for me as well. As someone who's worked with AI and with cybersecurity as well, within the organization, we started an initiative to adopt Coworker, let's say, Cloud
Mm.
Coworker, or agentic frameworks like Agent Zero. And there was an immediate concern from non technical professionals on the security of the documentation they were passing, the data residency issues, and how much access these systems wanted of their systems. So that was such a refreshing change for me as well. So with this ubiquitous adoption, there is a growing sense of cybersecurity or awareness of it as well. So that's very refreshing for me to see. Have you been able to see examples like that within the organizations that you're working with?
Yeah, I've seen it in the organizations that I've been working with, both our own, obviously, like we're an AI company, and there's use cases where our team want to use AI to advance and expedite delivery, right? But it's also a balance of making sure that we're keeping both our data and our customers' data, at hand and protected. Now, what I've seen from our customers has been quite fascinating because they're asking all kinds of questions around how the AI models are going to be used and what the data is inside of it. And I think that it is the same way that cybersecurity started out. It's still at its infancy. And I think that people are trying to figure out what that data is, how it gets used, what biases transpire out of it. And the data residency, as you pointed out, like how long is it being kept there and how is it being recycled?
Absolutely. And often on the other end of things, a problem with assessing this risk is measuring that risk. How do you measure AI risk on an ongoing basis, not just at the deployment level, but across the entire life cycle of the model?
For our product in particular, it's very important. Like we have clear measurables both on the false negative and false positives. And I think that's important when you have a very special use case. You want to make sure that you're measuring those things and how you drive them because it also drives some of the context of your contracts. It drives both what the expectation of the customer is, what your expectation is. I think it gets a little murky when you start to think about things like agentic AI, large language models, and stuff like that, because the success of that, I think, really is around the accuracy. And as we probably both know, some of those are not super accurate right now in the way they work, which means that every question that you ask can present a new answer that isn't necessarily a yes or no or a very defined answer. So I think what comes with that is a clear framework for those types of AI models on how both they're keeping risk out, like cybersecurity issues and data privacy, right? And not leaking that information. And ultimately, how they're going to start measuring those on accuracy. I think that's what's really going to drive the future. But for us in particular, a little bit different because we're a specialized use case, which is, I think, a much better place to be because you know what those outcomes need to be for the customer and for yourself.
That's a very interesting point. Defining a sandbox makes it much easier to define the adversaries as well. So I think that's a very smart move. Something that I've been struggling with as an implementer of agentic AI within different organizations is the generalization of the task. Could you speak more about adding specificity into your requirements because these agents are in their infancies? It's a very recent development that these agents have been pushed out to the masses. So the adoption seems to have infinite potential. But is it smart to pursue all of that potential at once?
I think it's maybe a bit naive, is the answer. I don't know if it's smart or not. I think that inherent trust needs to come with verification. I think is the right answer. And I think for task inside organizations where they're thinking about using agentic AI is that they need to measure those tasks and understand what the outcomes need to be. They also need to probably do continuous assessment on things that went wrong to figure out how they can fine tune them both from a response and from a question standpoint. Because chatbots have been around for a little while, right? And we know chatbots also have gone off the rails at times. But these agentic AI agents, in some cases, are being used both for good and bad. And you need to make sure that you're tracking all of that, not just how less work your team is doing, but the accuracy of what you're getting.
Absolutely. And accuracy measurements take time. And the
Yes.
largest or the biggest push towards agentic AI is quick adoption, quick replacement of manual workflows, quick decision making. And all of that expedited speed leads to vulnerabilities. Um, that segues us into our next question, which is what is the most dangerous assumption that enterprises are making about AI risk right now?
I think that the question I get often, at least for our product, is it self-learning, right? And my immediate response is, at least in my space in the competitors, I go, if anybody tells you that our AI is self-learning, they're lying to you. Because at the end of the day, you have to train all these models. And they're like infants. You know, we talked about infancy. They are infants. We're training them. We're teaching them. They're learning to walk. They're learning to run. They're going to make mistakes. How do you correct those mistakes? And that's why, at least for us, when we're thinking about our use case and we're thinking about weapons detection, like having control of that data, both input and output, is extremely important because garbage in is garbage out. And we don't want to have that happen in those use cases. If there's something wrong, we want to understand fully how that's working and how we can train that model moving forward. So I think customers often make the mistake. They hear AI, they think it's infallible. They think that it learns everything on its own, and it doesn't. And they think that that it's this panacea that works without people, because that's not true either. Because people need to understand how the AI engines work, how the technology comes together, because that's also how they need to train their people. Look for the gaps as well, so that way they can augment that and create a better solution. It's not something that you just turn on. I mean, if that was the case, you wouldn't be hearing lawsuits about, driverless cars or anything else, because there's going to be issues. There's going to be bad outcomes in some of these. It's how we deal with them that's the most important.
Absolutely. And I think an evolving understanding of the probabilistic nature of the outputs of these AI models, that's something I've seen on the rise as well. And that's a good sign for customers' AI adoption. A very fundamental or a high level analysis or an understanding of these of the functioning of an AI model is so important for the customer as well. Because oftentimes you see services on the internet that offer to do everything for you, and you're misled into that direction with false promises. And when you actually get it deployed, it doesn't achieve the purpose that it was made to achieve. So I think that's very aptly put. Um, let's talk about AI powered products, which is all the rage right now. When a company is building AI powered products for clients, how much of the risk conversation happens before versus after deployment?
I think, at least for us in the industry that we're in, we're seeing a lot more of it up front, right? Because there's already risk there from the get-go because people are trying to stop threats. I'm not sure that that's always a discussion in some other industries about what transpires and the risk that may come out of it. It may be more down to the industry that they're dealing with. Like government in general typically is involving that in all of their conversation and procurement. But you're not necessarily seeing that from all companies. If they're a technology company, they may have more of that insight to do it. I think a lot of other people are just looking for time savings and cost savings. They're not necessarily looking at the risk and the impact to their data or how it impacts their customers.
Absolutely. And I think it's a conversation that needs to happen because you're someone who's been heavily involved in cybersecurity as well. You must have seen this before. The only people that care about cybersecurity are those that have suffered at the cost of not caring about cybersecurity. So
So we used
I
to call it a significant emotional event. So typically when people had significant emotional events, then they had a panacea of an issue to do that. That's why we often, for us, we're very upfront with our customers out of the gate because we want them to be advocates. We don't want them to be a customer. We want them to be advocates of what this is because it's going to be a journey, right? We're building a product ourselves that's going to continuously like advance and grow with capabilities because the modeling is going to get better. So they need to understand how that comes together and how they can help us as part of that process. Remember, I told you people are an extremely important part of this process. And it creates an AI flywheel in my mind. One where we're able to work with the customer, they can provide us information and data training sets and those sort of things that can make our modeling better. And in turn, we can provide them a better product.
Absolutely. I think the feedback loop is so important in the design process and the administrative process. Something that I've seen on the rise as well is rapid acquisitions and rapid exchange of hands between the company ownership. How do you build an ownership model or a risk ownership model rather that survives an organizational restructuring or a change of ownership?
Yeah, I think it has to become part of the process and not down to the person. Remember, I said it's not about me. And some of that is training your organization. It's making sure that the policies dictate that that's what needs to go into place. And it needs to become part of your CI/CD pipeline, basically. Like some of those pieces need to be ingrained and automated. Some of them need to be down to like checks and validations around that definition of done. And when you have that, it stops becoming about the person. It starts becoming more of the outcome. Um, and that's the way we do it here at Xtract One. I have an amazing team, and I have no doubts that if something were to happen to me tomorrow, that this organization would run flawlessly without me because I have great people.
That inspires a lot of confidence. I think the DevOps processes, baking the frameworks within the CI/CD process, is at a very mature level at your end, but is at a very immature level within the industry itself. So you'd see the same processes are being followed for software integration as they were 5 or 10 years ago. But
Mm.
the pace at which everything's changing, it's probably it probably dictates that these processes are revised. So that's a word of caution to every owner out there. Let's talk about rolling out of AI tools. So when you roll out an enterprise AI tool, what does responsible change management look like from a risk perspective, not just an adoption, but accountability of that rollout?
Yeah, I think if I was going to give advice to customers or, even like anybody inside of a corporate structure that's looking to adopt a tool, I think you need to have two things in place. One is you need to understand what are the problems that your organization is trying to solve. Because if you don't understand that, you're probably already missing the boat, and there's probably shadow AI already occurring inside your organization. You don't even know it. The second part is I think that you need to work with those individuals and understand which pieces you can get in place as quickly as possible as part of that process to facilitate their job. Advocacy is extremely important in this process because people will run around you any day of the week. And then I would say make sure that you have not an overbearing policy or process, but one that focuses on the pieces of risk that you're trying to minimize. If it's data loss around, PII or data loss around like intellectual property, those are the pieces I think you really want to focus on when reviewing AI tools when they're coming in. Otherwise, you're trying to cut every corner and trying to find everything, and that may not even be important to your organization. And then you need to keep a list of those tools that you accept, and you need to inform people where they can go and find those and have a good process which people can present new AI technology that can be evaluated in a good process that's quick, and also one that can allow them to adopt that. And then at the end of the day, it always just comes down to financials in good business sense, because if you can't afford that technology, well, you probably shouldn't be using it in the first place.
And I think having such a framework or a protocol in place speeds things up so much as well. It standardizes the analysis process of adopting a new tool. The challenge that we're seeing every day is by the time you prepare an analysis of a tool, a comprehensive overview of that tool, uh, a new tool with new functionalities rolled out. So I think adopting that can be a sweet middle ground between adoption and safety would be having these protocols in place to be able to analyze these tools using a set framework. What are your thoughts on
Absolutely.
that?
Absolutely. I think you need that set framework. And again, I think you need to understand what the risk tolerance of your organization is. Because if you take some standard framework that maybe hasn't even been developed yet or actually fully outlined, and you're trying to like cut every single risk off of the corner, you're not going to make good business decisions, and you're not going to do it in a timely manner because it needs to be about what are the problems that you're trying to solve. And like for our customers, if they're looking for weapons detection systems, one of the things we like them to look at is like, have you already done like an operational assessment of what things are important to you and prioritize? Like if you're looking to just get people in fast, great. That may be what you're focusing on, but then don't be frustrated if you test a product that's super fast that doesn't do security well. So you need to think through these processes and how you're going to test them and how you're going to validate them too.
Absolutely. I think that's sage advice. As we talked about in the last few talking points, that AI is moving faster than most enterprise AI training programs. How do you keep your workforce's AI risk literacy current in real time?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Some of it's lunch and learn. Some of it's also like how you hire people inside your organization, and promoting good discussion around it. I think as soon as you turn the spigot off and you basically say nobody can talk about AI, well, one, you've already tied the organization's hands, and you've also made it so nobody wants to talk to you about the advancements that are occurring. So at least for us, I allow my team to look at new tools. We talk about how we're going to do it safely. We take it through a process, and we discuss what data is and is not going into those. We discuss if the financial outcome of acquiring such a tool outweighs that of just doing it ourselves, for instance, because I think there's also a lot of hype on some of these tools too, on whether or not they're actually going to provide good benefit and analysis for you. But if you have core use cases that can only be performed by AI, you really should lean into them. Our weapons detection system, for instance, is something that is very unique. Have the ability to tell the difference between a gun and a laptop from a single system without people having to divest is a huge advancement that it provides the ability to provide safety and more privacy. Like, that's an amazing use case. Like, and if you have other AI tools inside your organizations that provide that painkiller, then absolutely lean into them.
Absolutely. I think that's a very smart advice, not just in terms of your processes, but also analyzing a gap that you could fill with your own solution. Let's talk about the future. It's very hard to predict right now, but 5 years from now, which enterprises will have gotten the AI risk side of things right? And what have they done differently starting today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it may be like a prediction for the future in general, I think, is like who's going to survive. And I think that it's not about who's the fastest. I think it's about who has the highest efficacy velocity, meaning who can get to a point where there is an accurate trust in that system, regardless of the solution, and has a great customer experience. Those are the ones that are going to transcend all other products. I can run really fast and be extremely inaccurate in what I do. It doesn't make me the best product. So I think that those that are willing to like take the time, and this is the same thing that like my CEO and I talk about all the time. Like when I first came here 3 years ago, I said, let's solve the hard problems first. Let's get after the security pieces. Let's make sure that we have high efficacy on detecting weapons, and then I can make the system faster. And that's exactly what we've done, because it allows us the benefit to do things that others cannot.
Absolutely. You're 90% of the way there once you've solved the hard problems. And the minor problems only bring about incremental changes. That's very sound advice, I think. In every prioritization techniques, they usually tell you to eat your frogs first thing in the morning. And I think that's a very nice strategy, I'd say. Another thing that I loved about our discussion today was your emphasis on it being a business decision, it being a financial decision. So it's very important for any organizational leader or anywhere in the organization that you are right now to lean into these metrics. If you want a decision to be made, you need to either incentivize the outcome or de-incentivize going in an adversarial approach. And that's a very sound advice as well. So as we wrap up, one thing is clear: AI risk isn't just a problem for the future, it's a present day leadership responsibility. The challenge isn't just building powerful systems, but defining who owns their outcomes when things don't go as planned. Because in the enterprise, unmanaged AI risk doesn't stay technical, it quickly becomes operational, reputational, and strategic. So the organizations that get this right won't be the ones that are moving the fastest, but the ones that build clear accountability, embedded risk into the product, and treat AI decisions with the same rigor as any other business critical decision.
Mm,
So that's so important for longevity of a company as well.
mm.
Any final parting thoughts from you, Josh?
Yeah, I think that risk starts at the top, and it's an ownership of all. Much like we saw with cybersecurity, it took a while before we got cybersecurity expertise on the board. You're going to need that same expertise around AI in every single board seat. It needs to become the responsibility of CEOs, and it needs to be owned by everybody in the organization. Because at the end of the day, advancement is not going to go away. Technology is only going to drive faster. That innovation curve is exponential. And it comes down to people and good training and understanding all these pieces together. So my advice would be continue to educate, continue to drive for success, and look for those that are going to give you the trust in their processes and what they deliver.
Absolutely, I think that's very insightful, Josh. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Thank you so much for sharing your time and experience with us today. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into Pure Logic's Pulse. We'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you.